Welcome to the monthly virtual infertility workshop. I'm so glad you're here. If you're new, hey, I'm Kristin or Kiki, and I'm an infertility coach. I help women reduce the stress, anxiety, and fear associated with IVF so they can go through the process hopeful, supported, and with no regrets. Each month, I invite an infertility expert to dive deep into one area related to infertility. They share about the medical side, and I share about the emotional side. Sign up at this link to be notified about future infertility workshops so that you can join us live, and you can also get the replay sent directly to your inbox. Okay, well, welcome everybody to the infertility workshop for October. I am so glad you're here, whether this is your first time or your seventh time and you're an official groupie, welcome. Whether you're here live or watching this on YouTube with the replay, I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items just to make sure that everybody understands what to expect and how we do this, again, in case you're new. So we started this, Dr. Likes and I started this in April as a way to bring some information, education to women about infertility, all the options and all the steps associated with it, just to help keep you informed, which can totally help with the process. But by also then pairing that with the emotional side, which is what I do, because I'm an infertility coach. I went through IVF to become a mother, and I just have this passion in my heart to help women going through the journey. So by working together, I help women reduce the stress, fear, and anxiety associated with IVF so that they can feel hopeful and supported and go through the process without any regrets. Every month, we bring a guest expert to focus on one area. And tonight, we're going to be talking about embryos. This is a safe space. This is a place to be supported, to be around other people who understand and get it. So there's no question that's stupid. You are not alone. And I promise that probably what you're thinking and feeling, someone else in the room feels that way too. Let me see. We do this every month. So now that you're on the list, it means you will be notified of all the future ones. And I hope you continue to join us. We will start with Dr. Edmonds sharing about embryos, and then I will share about the emotional side. I'm talking about handling the holidays as they are just around the corner. So it's not too much planning, honestly. And afterwards, the doctors will leave, and then I open it up for a support group. And that's where everybody turns on their cameras, unmutes themselves, and it's really talking sort of peer-to-peer with other women who get it and understand. So that is most of all of the details related to it. I'm glad you're here, and I am so happy to introduce Dr. Wes Edmonds. He actually is the embryologist over at University of Alabama in Birmingham, and he was the embryologist who helped me on my IVF journey. So I have a personal connection to him and trust him with my life and my daughter's life, and really have heard such good things about him before I started there, while I was there, and even afterwards. So I'm really excited to give you the opportunity to learn from him too. He has this wonderful way of sharing some scientific, really detailed information in a way that you can walk away understanding it and feeling really empowered with that information. With that said, Dr. Edmonds, I'd love to pass it over to you and say thank you. I can't wait to hear what you've got to share with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kristin and Dr. Likes, for having me tonight. I'm very happy to be here to discuss lots of fun embryology things with all you guys. I think, unfortunately, there's a big disconnect in our field in that oftentimes patients don't get to spend a lot of time talking with the people behind the magical doors of their laboratory, the lab director and the embryologist, and being able to ask them really hard pressing questions. And so I hope that through this webinar and future webinars, we will be able to answer some of those burning questions that you have, whether it be with myself or with other lab directors or embryologists. With that being said, I think that maybe one of the first things that I want to say that it's very important as we go through discussion today, and as you guys hear talk from physicians or lab directors, to understand that There are many ways to do the things that we do every day to try to help you guys achieve your goal of pregnancy, or to at least give you the very best care that we can. And so one lab may do embryo grading in a totally different way than another lab. And that doesn't mean that they're better or worse. They're just different. There are different models out there, and different lab directors use different models for different reasons, and whether it be their training or they have a belief that outcomes are better with one particular thing than another. And unfortunately, there's also a little bit of voodoo with IVF lab work. There's when IVF was conceived in the late 70s and early 80s. A bunch of scientists got together and basically created culture media, threw a bunch of things together that they knew worked for other cells and for other embryos from other organisms, to see if it would work on human embryos. And when it did, they just sort of stuck with a lot of those things. And so there are some things that, especially with the old dogs in the field, there's a little bit of voodoo. And, we do it this way because we do it this way. But please be aware that there are many ways to do the things that we do. The other disclaimer that I have for you is that, again, I am a PhD trained scientist. I am not a physician, so I am not qualified to talk to you about your stimulation protocols or your particular prognosis based on your diagnosis. I can talk to you about what happens behind the doors of an embryology or an andrology lab and sort of talk you through any of the detailed things that happen there. But that's the extent of what I am qualified to do. So moving forward, tonight, what I really wanted to talk about was embryo morphology and trying to understand, if you get a grade, if you go through an IVF cycle and your physician calls or your lead nurse calls and says, this is the grades of your embryos that we're able to cryopreserve, or this is the grade of the embryo that we're transferring today, what that means and what this grading means for your chances of success with either a fresh embryo transfer, a cryopreserved embryo transfer cycle, or even embryo biopsy. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have a mixture of my face, and we're going to flip back and forth between my face and some slides that I put together in PowerPoint to sort of walk you through pictures of eggs and embryos so that you can have a visual of what we're talking about. So referring to your worksheet, if any of you guys have the worksheet that Kristin sent out, there were a couple of main topics that I wanted to cover. And one of those I understand that Dr. Likes has covered in one of his previous videos, but I'll touch on it just a little bit. And that's the idea of attrition as you go through the IVF process. How is it that, I started with 15 eggs and I ended up with 3 embryos? How did we get there? That doesn't seem to make sense. So in order to do that, I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to discuss the egg retrieval and egg morphology and what eggs look like when we retrieve them. So I'm going to start with a share screen here, and you guys let me know. Can everybody see my slide? Yes, very good. So what we have here is 5 pictures, and these are the 5 major categories of what you would see on the day of an egg retrieval when we do an egg retrieval. Top left, we have what's called a germinal vesicle. That's a very immature oocyte. That's what the oocytes would look like before your trigger shot for IVF. And the trigger shot causes that germinal vesicle, or that circular nucleus in the center of that cell, to break down and start the process of maturation of that oocyte. So that's called a germinal vesicle, or a GV. The next picture that we have, top center, is an M1. So this is a metaphase 1 oocyte. What that means is it has resumed the process of oocyte maturation. And from the GV stage all the way through the M1 stage to the M2 stage is basically one big continuous process. Once you start the process of maturation of that GV oocyte with your trigger, then the endpoint is hopefully an M2 oocyte, which is what you see on the top right. The way we tell the difference between an M1 and an M2 oocyte is that one little bleb that's labeled with an F there. That F stands for something that was in the legend of the original figure and is not really associated with what I want to talk about tonight. just know that that F is called a polar body, and that's where the first set of genetic information is extruded from that oocyte. So an immature oocyte has 4 copies of genetic information from the mother. So in the first round of division, it extrudes half of that into that first polar body, and the other half is remaining in the oocyte. And the oocyte will remain in that M2 stage until fertilization occurs. So the other options for what we might see on the day of an egg retrieval are our bottom 2 pictures. The one on the left is an atretic oocyte. So with the process of IVF, what we're trying to do is your ovaries every month have a certain number of antral follicles that are going to start responding to hormones. 1 or 2 of those follicles is going to sort of declare itself the dominant follicle, and it will then take off and become the oocyte that matures and can then be fertilized naturally. The rest of those follicles every month die off naturally through a process called atresia. And so this is what an atretic oocyte looks like. We're not always able to rescue every oocyte with the process of a hyperstimulation. So sometimes we retrieve oocytes that look atretic. It's fairly rare. We shouldn't see a whole lot of those. If a patient has 3 or 4 atretic oocytes at the time of a retrieval, then there's probably some underlying pathology there. But that is another option for what you might see at the time of an egg retrieval. And the bottom right picture is a fractured zona pellucida. So the basket of meshwork that surrounds the egg that you can see in the top center here or in the top right. Just imagine that this oocyte is a little cell that's surrounded by a wicker basket. It's basically a network of proteins. And what can happen sometimes with the egg retrieval process, because of the way the egg may get pressed against the side of a follicle, the way that it sort of comes around the tip of the needle into the tubing so that we can collect that egg, sometimes those zona will be ruptured. It'll actually cause the zona pellucida to break, and the oocyte will be sucked out and lost. Again, that happens fairly rarely. You should expect to see that maybe 3% of the time or less. If you start seeing it more than that, then maybe there's some issues with your suction. But if you go through an IVF cycle and you happen to have a fractured zona, this is what this means. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there was something wrong with you. That doesn't mean that that's something that's going to occur again in the future. It's just one of the options for what we see at the time of egg retrieval. So this is the first point in talking about attrition and how we go from, an average of 12 oocytes per retrieval down to maybe 3 or 4 embryos. The first place that we lose cellular material in this process is just with the maturation of the eggs and what we're able to retrieve. So if we retrieve 12 eggs on average, we would expect about 80% of those to be mature. So you would expect maybe 9 or 10 oocytes to be mature in most cases. So there already we're down from 12 to 8 or 10. Those oocytes will either be fertilized via conventional insemination or ICSI, where we actually inject sperm into the eggs, but that's something that can be covered in a different topic, a different webinar. So we're going to go on and look at the next phases of embryonic development so that you guys have an idea of how things look as we progress through the days after insemination and the fertilization check. So the top left-hand picture that we see here is of a day 1 zygote. This is an egg that has been fertilized. I see several sperm bound to this egg. So this was an egg that was fertilized by conventional insemination. Inside the oocyte, we have 2 circular bodies that are called pronuclei. So one of those is a nucleus that's genetic material from mom, and the other one is genetic material from dad. So that's what we're looking for on the day of fertilization check to show that an oocyte has been fertilized. Sometimes you can have abnormal fertilization, which means that you would have 3 of these circular pronuclei, or maybe only 1 of them, depending on what regulatory body your lab subscribes to. Some are more restrictive than others and mandate that anything that is fertilized abnormally be discarded and not be cultured out further, because there can be problems with pregnancies related to embryos that were derived from eggs that fertilized abnormally. But in the top left picture, this is what we hope to see on day 1 at the time of your fertilization check, is a beautiful 2PN oocyte or zygote. The top center picture is also on day 1. This is generally about 24 hours to 28 hours after the time of your insemination. That's when the first cell division occurs. So we go from 1 cell to 2 on the first day. Top right picture, day 2, that's a 4-cell embryo. So that's what we expect to see on day 2. And then by day 3, the bottom left picture, we expect to see an embryo somewhere between 6 and 8 cells. So an important thing to know about embryos at this stage is that there's a lot of stuff happening, even though what you see is just 4 cells or 6 cells or 8 cells. Between day 2 and day 3, there are a lot of things happening in those cells that are going to tell us about the competency of these embryos. Up until day 3, when we look at those embryos, what we see is a dividing bag of cells, basically. There's nothing there that shows us that these embryos have exhibited any sort of genetic competence up to this point. The cells in these embryos are relying on leftover genetic information from the oocyte, from mom, and they're using that genetic information to go through their cellular divisions. Somewhere around day 2 is when the genome or the DNA of the embryo is activated itself. And it takes some time for that process to happen, so that RNA and proteins are produced so that you can see an outcome from that. And in the bottom right picture, that's what we see. On day 4, you hope to see a morula. A morula was named that because it looks like a little mulberry. And what happens is the individual cells of that embryo that you see in day 3, they start to get sort of sticky and they stick together and they form this amorphous blob called a morula. So that's the first sign of genetic competence of your embryos, and that's a very good thing. So talking again about morphology and what it means for your outcomes and how to interpret information when you get that from your physician, if your particular clinic happens to do grading on day 3 and relay that information to the patient, some clinics do and some clinics don't. What you need to understand about day 3 embryo grades is that you can have a beautiful 8-cell embryo that ends up not creating an embryo, not leading to an embryo that could implant or lead to a healthy pregnancy. Again, at day 3, what we're seeing is just a dividing bag of cells. On the other hand, you may see an embryo on day 3 that's sort of average quality. It may be a 6-cell with some fragmentation and asymmetric cells that ends up being a really beautiful embryo on day 5 and leads to a viable pregnancy. So the field as a whole over the last several years has sort of gotten away from the idea of focusing on day 3 morphology, especially as we have moved away from day 3 embryo transfers as a whole. So I'm going to flip to the next slide now, and this is what we hope to see on day 5 and day 6. So these are blastocyst stage embryos. These I'm going to focus on the bottom left picture because it's sort of easier to point out what the different morphological characteristics of the embryo are. At 9 o'clock in this bottom left picture, this blob of cells that you see is the inner cell mass. It's a really original name, I know. The inner cell mass is the mass of cells that, generally speaking, is going to give rise to the baby itself. All these other cells around the outside of the embryo are called trophectoderm cells, and those cells are the cells that are going to give rise in general to the placenta. So the grading system that we use, actually, I'll cover this one thing first. So these blastocyst stage embryos, what happens between day 4 and day 5 or 6 is, again, I mentioned when we were talking about an oocyte to imagine it as just a singular cell that's surrounded by this mesh network or this wicker basket, so to speak. So the reason for that wicker basket, for that zona pellucida, is that it holds the cells together in close proximity to each other until that embryonic genome is activated so that those cells can stick together and start developing into a proper blastocyst stage embryo. After they've stuck together, we don't really need that zona pellucida anymore. There is some protective benefit of the zona pellucida for the embryo as you go through shear mechanical stresses with cryopreservation and other things. But the embryo itself doesn't really need that zona pellucida beyond that point. So the embryo has to have a way to get out. And the way that it does that is the cells of the trophectoderm, again, those bubbly cells around the outside of the embryo, they have transporters that pump water into the inside of that embryo. And in pumping water into that inner cavity, what it does is it expands and expands and expands. And finally, it can break through that zona pellucida, and that is hatching. And then the embryo is able to implant into your uterine wall. So this picture that I've just brought up in the bottom left is of a day 3 embryo again. And this is pretty close to scale what you would expect to see size-wise of a day 3 embryo versus a really pretty expanded blastocyst. So this zona pellucida on the day 3 embryo you can see is really thick. And by the time this embryo expands, it gets really thin and it eventually hatches out. By day 6, when the embryo starts to hatch out, this is what it looks like. The trophectoderm cells bust through that zona pellucida and the embryo continues to expand. It forces its way out of the zona pellucida and then it's ready to implant. So blastocyst grading, again, is very important for understanding what your chances of success might be with a frozen embryo transfer, fresh embryo transfer, embryo biopsy, or whatever. So the way that the field in general has done this over the last 30 years and also individual labs is we have analyzed our outcomes data. We've said, okay, this embryo looked like this. Did it lead to a pregnancy? Based on those results, we've been able to create a grading system. Again, every lab has a little bit different grading system. The most common one is a Gardner grading system. That's the one that I use in my laboratory. There are a lot of practices around that use a more simplified grading system that's maybe easier for the patients to understand. Sometimes they may call an embryo a grade 1 or grade 2 embryo, whereas the 1 is the best quality embryo and 2 is a little bit less, and so on and so forth. But blastocyst embryo grading allows us to be able to select the embryos that are going to give you the best chances of success, and allows us to discard those embryos that are not going to give you a good chance for success. Now, I know that sounds really ethically sticky, and in fact it is, because laboratorians are left with a very tough decision, relying on their grading system and deciding which embryos are most likely to give you a chance at a good outcome, and deciding what that lower cutoff should be for embryo grade. If you have a really poor grade embryo that has only a 1% chance of implantation, you probably don't want to freeze 20 of those for a patient, because it ends up being a lot of false hope. It ends up being a lot of money spent for that patient that may not have been helpful for them in the end. But there are situations where this can be handled on a case-by-case basis, and having a firm understanding of how this works and being able to discuss this with your care providers is helpful. That being said, don't expect to be able to go into your practice and say, I want every embryo frozen because I don't want any chance thrown away. That's just not the way that this works. We have a very good handle on what our chances of success are with different grades of embryos. So trust your laboratorians, trust your lab directors, and know that we are behind the scenes doing everything that we can to help you be successful. So the last statement that I'll have about attrition through the IVF process and how we end up losing embryos along the way is with blastocyst embryo grading. At the end of the day, some of those embryos make it to beautiful blastocyst stage embryos and others don't. And if by the end of day 6, the embryo is not a blastocyst stage embryo, it's probably not going to do anything, and those embryos are going to be discarded. And so the breakdown generally is let's say for the sake of making it easy, we retrieve 10 eggs. 80% of those we expect to be mature, so you've got 8 mature. About another 80% of those we expect to fertilize, so maybe 6 or 7 are fertilized. And of the ones that fertilize, we expect maybe 50% of those to be usable. So that's how you go from 10 oocytes down to 3 embryos that are usable in the end. Back to blastocyst embryo grading. So this Gardner scale for grading that I use in my laboratory and many other laboratories use, it can be a fairly complicated scale to use. So I'm just going to give you the high points. Basically, what we're grading is the degree of expansion of an embryo, and we're giving a letter grade to the inner cell mass, and we're giving a letter grade to the trophectoderm. So these are all the various options for levels of expansion of an embryo from the morula stage all the way to a hatch blast. Most of the time, the embryos that we're transferring are a 4 or a 5. So you may have heard that you were getting a 4AA transferred. And so a 4 is an expanded blast, and that's what you would expect to see by day 5 or day 6 of embryo culture. The next grade that would be listed for an embryo is the inner cell mass grade, with A being best and D being worst. And the same thing for trophectoderm. We have a grade of A through D, with A being best and D being worst. So these are some pictures to give you an idea of what those various grades might look like. So the top left picture is a picture of a grade 1 embryo, or an expansion grade 1. So this is a cavitating morula, which means that less than half of the embryo is filled with a cavity. So this is very early, the sort of thing that you would expect to see on day 4 of embryo development. By the second and third picture here, these are a little further developed. You can see that blastocele cavity is starting to expand. Then the next row are grade 3 expansion embryos. And so these are more what you would expect to see early on day 5. The blastocele cavity is forming better. By the bottom row, you can see a big, beautiful blastocele cavity. That embryo has started to expand. And then over on the right, the bottom right, is a fully hatched AA embryo. It's a very clear inner cell mass, very clear trophectoderm cells. So that is a grade 6 AA embryo. Just to give you an idea of where you might get a grade C or a grade of B, if we look at this picture in the very center over here on the left, this is a 3CB embryo. The first letter grade again refers to the grade of the inner cell mass. And the reason that this embryo got a grade of C was because you see several distinct cells here for this inner cell mass. They're not very well compacted. They're not very well defined as a singular mass of cells. So that's a fairly poor grade for an inner cell mass. So far as the trophectoderm, we see some bubbly cells here. It's still really early. There's a chance that this embryo over the course of the next 12 hours could become an A trophectoderm, or it could go the other way and become a C trophectoderm. So it's really hard to know with early blastocysts what they're going to look like later in development. So this is where I'm going to end my general discussion of, I'm going to stop the share so that maybe we can just go back to my face. This is where we're going to stop our general discussion of embryo morphology and start talking about how embryo morphology affects your chances of success and your outcome in the end. So let's start with talking about a blastocyst, an expanded blastocyst stage embryo that you are either going to biopsy or you're going to cryopreserve that embryo. With a cryopreserved embryo, what we have to do is we have to take that embryo, and again, remember, this is a big bag of cells with a bunch of fluid inside. The cryoprotectants that we have to use to protect your embryo in the cryopreservation process, unfortunately, they're actually toxic for the cells themselves. So we have to find a balance between applying a cryoprotectant to your oocyte or to your embryo and not causing toxicity to that embryo. And the way that we help with that is we collapse these blastocyst stage embryos. So we'll create a hole or a breach in that embryo that allows that embryo to collapse down on itself. And by doing that, all of that fluid from inside the embryo is removed from the embryo. And then the cryoprotectants are able to better penetrate all of those cells in a short period of time. So this next picture that I want to show you is of, on the left, an expanded embryo. And if we were going to be freezing this embryo, we would take a laser and we would pulse between two of these cells, and that would allow the fluid to seep out of that embryo, and it would collapse into something like you see on the right-hand side. This is a collapsed embryo. This particular embryo is after it was thawed from the cryopreservation process, but this is exactly what an embryo would look like if it were collapsed prior to cryopreservation. So this is the first major point with understanding why the grade of your embryo is important for success with cryopreservation or embryo biopsy or any of these things. So if the trophectoderm of your embryo has 100 to 120 cells, it's a beautiful grade A trophectoderm, and we were to take a laser and pulse between two of those cells to collapse that embryo, then the embryo would collapse down really tightly on itself. And then after we thawed that embryo and put it back into culture, then that embryo would very easily be able to heal that breach that you created and re-expand so that it could hatch, and so that it would be able to implant into your uterus. So I felt the need to wave. We got lots of waving going on. How's everybody doing? Am I talking too much? Are we good? Can I get thumbs up? All right. So again, back to the collapsing process of the embryo. If we have a poor quality trophectoderm, if it's a grade C trophectoderm, and we create a hole in that trophectoderm may only have 20 or 30 cells. And that embryo is going to have a much harder time healing after the freezing and thawing process. So that is how the embryo morphology, the morphology of the trophectoderm, can have such an impact on your success with a frozen thaw cycle. The morphology of the inner cell mass itself is very important, but it's actually not so important for the very early stages of your trying to get pregnant. The trophectoderm cells are the cells that are responsible for hatching and for implantation. And then those inner cell mass cells are going to continue to develop and lead to the baby in the end. But ultimately, if the embryo is unable to implant, then the quality of those inner cell mass cells is really sort of irrelevant, because you could have a beautiful inner cell mass and really poor quality trophectoderm. And the trophectoderm never gives that inner cell mass the chance that it needs, because it's unable to implant into the uterus. So that's the issue with cryopreservation and the grade of the trophectoderm. So moving on to embryo biopsy. If we are biopsying an embryo, I have another cool thing to share with you guys. So this is a video of an embryo that was biopsied in my laboratory. I hope you guys can all see that. On the left-hand side over here is where we're holding the embryo in place. You can see the inner cell mass is up at about 10 o'clock. We're protecting that from where we're going to be doing our biopsy. Theoretically, all of the cells in the embryo are usually the same genetically. So when we do an embryo biopsy, we try to take 6 to 8 cells from away from the inner cell mass. That trophectoderm generally can heal itself very easily. We're not affecting the cells of the inner cell mass, and then hopefully that embryo will be able to heal and re-expand and reimplant. So that's what we see here. The inner cell mass is far away from the spot of biopsy. With this particular biopsy technique, we're using a laser. Most laboratories now are using a laser for blastocyst stage embryo biopsy. And I'm going to click play. Maybe. All right, here we go. So you can see on the right, there's a pipette that we're using to gently suck cells of the trophectoderm into that pipette. And we're just going to gently tease those cells out of the zona pellucida. And once we get a portion of those cells teased out, then we're going to start using our laser to systematically pulse between junctions of cells. So don't think of the laser as some knife that's just going to blast through your embryo. Basically, we use the laser as a controlled heat source. And what that does is it breaks down the proteins between cells just momentarily, just long enough to allow us to sort of pull those cells apart. We don't use a high enough frequency of the laser that would blast your whole embryo or fry it in the dish or anything crazy like that. It's not quite as sci-fi as you might hope, but the laser is really just a low frequency controlled heat source to allow us to separate those cells. So we keep applying pressure and keep pulsing those junction between those cells until there you go. We've removed the sample for the embryo biopsy. 6 to 8 cells, they get stuck in a tube, they get sent off for genetic testing. The remaining embryo that we see up there now has collapsed. It's collapsed down on itself, whereas before it was fully expanded. So once it's fully collapsed, which is going to take a couple of minutes, we'll put that embryo in the cryoprotectant and we'll go ahead and freeze that embryo. When we get the results of the genetic testing back, then the ones that are normal, we can thaw and use those for embryo transfers. So the reason that embryo biopsy or that embryo morphology is so important for embryo biopsy is that imagine if that trophectoderm, again, it's just a big ball of cells. Imagine that trophectoderm has 120 cells that are really small, have really nice compact nuclei. We can go in, we can get 6 to 8 of those cells, and that's just a small portion. That's less than 10% of the total cellular mass of the embryo. So we're taking a very small portion of that bubble, and we're putting that into a tube for genetic testing. So when we thaw that embryo, there's a very small void in that trophectoderm that has to heal so that that embryo can re-expand. Conversely, if we have an embryo that has a poor quality trophectoderm, so if it's a C-grade trophectoderm, we only see maybe 20 to 25 cells in the trophectoderm. In doing the embryo biopsy, we're actually taking half of the cells in the trophectoderm. So what we end up doing is losing a large portion of the cellular mass of the embryo, and that embryo will not have the ability sometimes to heal itself and re-expand and implant into the uterus. Because in the back end of the embryo thaw, all of a sudden we're fighting against our, we're fighting against uterine receptivity. So if it takes too long for that embryo to heal and re-expand, then it may have missed the window of opportunity for implantation. So that's how, that's why embryo morphology is so important for success with embryo biopsy and cryopreservation. So I intended for that to be short and conversational, and maybe it wasn't, but we'll stop there. I've got some other slides that I could show if questions take us there, but I'd really like to take some questions from you guys and see if you have any burning questions about embryo morphology and how it might affect things.
Well, thank you, Dr. Edmonds. So like you said, if you guys have questions, please don't be shy. This is an opportunity for you to get him to answer your questions, to find out more. You're in a safe place. No question is stupid. You can type it in or feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. Sometimes it helps too if there's some follow-up questions that he might have. But yeah, ask some questions. My mind is like totally blown with what I've learned today. And I feel like I thought I was well-versed already. So thank you for taking it to a whole new level already. Does anybody have any questions? I only see a couple people on video, so I can't tell too.
So I've got one question here that I can answer while other people are maybe typing in their questions.
Great.
So the question here is, what is the relative risk to thawing an embryo that was previously frozen for biopsy and then refreezing that embryo and thawing it again later for a frozen embryo transfer? Sometimes patients will want to do that if maybe they had embryos frozen 5 to 7 years ago before embryo biopsy was such a huge thing and people were doing it so frequently as they are now. Sometimes with patients with recurrent implantation failure, or recurrent pregnancy losses of embryo transfers, they may want to go back and test the embryos and see if there's some genetic component to why they're maybe losing their pregnancies. The answer is there can be some harm to the embryos. Generally speaking, it's not a lot. And it does depend on the grade of the embryo initially when it's frozen. So embryos that are super good quality 4AAs when they're frozen with a beautiful intercell mass and a beautiful trophectoderm. The way that I like to handle these in my laboratory is in the afternoon, I'll come in and I'll thaw them late at maybe 6 p.m. I'll allow those embryos to grow overnight and give them full opportunity to heal and re-expand. And by 6 a.m. the next morning, they have redeclared themselves as healthy, thriving, viable embryos. We can then take those embryos that have healed and re-expanded and biopsy them and cryopreserve them. And those embryos will do pretty much as well as embryos that were only frozen and thawed one time or biopsied before they were frozen the first time. If you have an embryo that was frozen that's a poor quality embryo with a poor quality trophectoderm, those embryos are going to have a lesser chance of doing well in the first place with the freeze-thaw process. They're going to have a harder time healing that hole in the trophectoderm that was created when they were collapsed. They're going to have a harder time re-expanding. And then you're going to be left with fewer cells again to biopsy. And then you're going to be refreezing that and thawing it again. So things do not bode well for those embryos that initially had a poor quality. So in making the decision to thaw, biopsy, refreeze embryos, knowing the grade of your embryos is very important because that can mean the difference in success or not.
That's really interesting. Dr. Likes had mentioned when you were sharing before to ask you about the size of the pipette used for the embryo.
Yeah, that was just a wow factor kind of question in terms of under the microscope.
Yeah.
But that, and Dr. Edmonds, can you give your 2-minute spiel on what your thoughts are on mosaicism? That's a big category, or no? You tell me.
I think that you said 2-minute spiel because you know that I talk too much. But I can absolutely give you a 2-minute spiel.
I just know that's not a 2-minute spiel. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah. But do you have a particular concept about mosaicism that you would like me to touch on?
Well, if the genetic testing proves that's all they have in terms of PGTA shows abnormalities and mosaicism is a factor, transfer, contemplation, those sorts of things.
Right. So I think that transferring mosaic embryos can be okay. The literature shows us that in a large majority of the time, especially with low-level mosaics. Now in the era of next generation sequencing, we've got high-level mosaics and low-level mosaics. And all that's really referring to is how many abnormal cells they saw in that trophectoderm sample that we sent them. And so if it's a low-level mosaic and maybe only 20%, 1 out of the 6 cells or 2 out of the 8 cells that we sent them was abnormal, then in that situation, we hope that a smaller portion of the embryo overall is abnormal. The other thing that we hope with transferring mosaic embryos is that we have an embryo that is genetically abnormal only in the trophectoderm and not in the inner cell mass. So, all right, so this is a little schematic for what happens when you have a mosaic embryo. So basically, this embryo on the left, imagine all these little circles are individual cells. The brown cells are normal cells. The ones that are blue are abnormal cells. So during embryonic development, there sometimes can be errors in the division of the DNA in the cell. That can happen when the embryo is dividing from 2 cells to 4, which means that maybe 25% of the cells will be abnormal. It can happen in that initial split, which means that half of the cells will be abnormal. Or it can happen after the embryo already has 100 cells, which means only a very small portion of that embryo is going to be abnormal. So when we do an embryo biopsy, we have no way of knowing. We have to assume that all of the cells in the trophectoderm are abnormal. So I don't know that I can get this to play when we're not in. So when we do the embryo biopsy, we go in and remove a section of the trophectoderm that is 6 to 8 cells. That may or may not include cells that are abnormal or normal. So in this particular slide, what you see is that the section of cells that were taken over in the right were all normal cells. And so the result you got back was that it was a normal embryo, where in fact there were abnormal cells in the trophectoderm and in the inner cell mass, and we just didn't see it with the embryo biopsy. And as you might imagine, the same is true for, we may get a patch of cells in the trophectoderm that are abnormal, and the embryo biopsy results come back, the genetic testing results come back and tell us that that embryo is abnormal, but maybe it was only that one little patch of cells that was abnormal. And there are millions of variations, combinations in between of levels of severity of embryo mosaicism. So I think that if all that you have is a mosaic embryo and you have no other options and you're properly informed, and it's a low-level mosaic and it's not on a chromosome like 13 or 21 or one of the ones that may lead to a live birth of a severely, disadvantaged child, then I think mosaic transfer is very much an option. Are you in agreement or disagreement with me, Dr. Likes?
I'm going to play Switzerland on that. No, we have done some mosaic transfers for sure. If that's all they have, yes.
Yeah.
With proper informed consent, genetic counseling, those sorts of things, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really tricky because there can be positive outcomes, but there can also be poor outcomes, and it should absolutely be a last resort. And unfortunately, genetic testing now has gotten so good that we're getting so much information back about the cells that there are segmental aneuploidies. And in this particular cell, only a very small piece of DNA was missing, not a whole chromosome, but a small piece of a chromosome. So what does that really mean? And those, it's more information is getting to the point to where it's not more information. It just sort of muddies the water right now. In the end, I think that we'll find that more information tells us more, with new algorithms for determining what these small aneuploidies look like with outcomes. But in the short term, it really is challenging to answer some of those questions.
Oh, about genetic testing and the companies that are available. Is there options to go to a different person or company to do the testing?
That's a really good question. So there are lots of companies out there. Most of the companies are using the same sort of technologies. Most of them are using a next generation sequencing platform that's actually the exact same platform that's all coming from another company that's selling them the kits. And so, so the testing that they're all doing, most of them is pretty similar. There are a couple of companies that are sticking to their guns and their roots of doing SNP array testing, which is another way of determining the aneuploidy of embryos. And that methodology does have its strengths and it does have its weaknesses. Most of the time, a particular clinic will have a relationship with a genetic testing company. And the reason that the clinic may have that relationship with that particular company can be multifold. So the reason that we use the company that we use is they use next generation sequencing. They use a really robust platform. So first and foremost, we believe in the science. And the other reason that we have chosen them over the other companies that have the same product is all of the extra services they provide, such as genetic counseling. If patients have any questions whatsoever about the results of their embryo biopsy, they can schedule an appointment with that company's genetic counselor, and they're going to be much better versed in the details of that situation than maybe our maternal fetal medicine genetic counselors will be. So that's the short of it. It's sort of hard to shop around as a patient, to shop around for a genetic testing company, and most of the time it's not necessary, because the reality is that all of the companies and all of the testing platforms have their own weaknesses. So, trust that your medical director and your lab director have talked through things and figured out that with a particular set of testing methodologies that a company is using, that's the best fit for their patient population. And you really just need to have faith that decision has not been made lightly.
Okay, does anybody have any questions who wants to unmute themselves?
I'm wondering, are there situations where the biopsy or the screenings are not necessarily the route you want to go? Are the grade levels good enough for moving forward? Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. So your question is, are there situations where maybe the embryo, we thought in the beginning that we wanted to do embryo biopsy, but maybe the grade of the embryos ended up being low enough that we decided embryo biopsy wasn't the right course for that patient? Is that kind of?
Perhaps that's what I mean. Yeah, 'cause I know, like, maybe you're trying to cut cost, and it's like, if it's not necessary, when would it not be necessary, and you could save a little money by not moving forward with
I
screening or
understand. I
biopsy.
understand. Okay, good question. So the thing to understand about embryo biopsy and genetic testing is doing genetic testing does not increase your chances of getting pregnant. All that genetic testing is going to do is it's going to decrease your time to pregnancy. So if you have 8 embryos and by chance 5 of them are normal and 3 of them are abnormal, and we didn't know that, and we were randomly picking embryos, and the first 2 transfers randomly picked 2 that were abnormal, then it took 3 transfers for you to get to a healthy pregnancy. If we had that information up front, then we would have picked an embryo that was genetically normal and you would have a shorter time to pregnancy. You got pregnant either way, but it was quicker to pregnancy. So for those patients that are maybe of advanced maternal age, that have diminished ovarian reserve, that we end up not getting a lot of embryos, if you only have 1 embryo, the question is, what is the reason that you're doing genetic testing? And what ultimately will you do with that information? And that oftentimes requires a lot of soul searching and determining, if I get a result back that my embryo is trisomy 21 to be a Down syndrome child, what would I do with that information? Would I decide not to transfer that embryo, or would I transfer that embryo? And if the answer is that you would transfer that embryo, and if you only had 1 embryo or 2 embryos in the first place, then maybe doing the genetic testing is not the right road for you if the money is a consideration. All right, so I had a couple other questions here that I can touch on real quickly. One of those was, if we choose to donate surplus embryos to science, what usually happens to them? So that's a tricky question, and that's one that depends on the state that you live in. It depends on the particular clinic that you work for. Some states, strictly forbid any sort of research on on embryonic materials, and it's going to vary from clinic to clinic. In the state of Alabama, where I am, doing embryonic stem cell research is a very hard thing to do, and I can't just take embryos and start growing them in dishes and doing actual research with them. So in my clinic, when patients donate their embryos to science, they're actually donating those embryos to training of future embryologists with thawing embryos and training on embryo biopsy and training on refreezing of embryos. And that is invaluable information and invaluable material to have to be able to train future generations of embryologists. Unfortunately, this is one of those fields where you can't just go in and try something and see if you're good at it. Failure is not really an option. So it's really, really difficult to train people, and having that material helps a lot. And finally, if we choose to destroy embryos, how is that process done? So if a patient decides that they have 5 embryos left in cryopreservation and they're finished growing their family and they don't want the rest of those embryos anymore and they want to destroy them, how is that done? So we personally in my clinic have various options for what patients can do with those. They can destroy them, they can donate them to science, or they can even donate them as an anonymous embryo donor. The more often than not, patients decide that they don't want to donate embryos anonymously. It just sort of weirds people out for some reason, and we have a hard time getting people to agree to that. If the patient decides to destroy those embryos, there are a couple of options. It's funny that I got this question because I actually got an email today from a company called Sacred Heart Guardians. And this is a company that it's a Catholic organization that will allow you to ship embryos to them, whether these are embryos that have tested abnormal genetically, embryos that just the patient doesn't want to store anymore, whatever the situation is. They pay the cost to ship them. They bury them in a burial plot with a priest. They send you the information back for the cemetery and the burial plot where your embryos are buried. And that's actually an option that is no cost to the patient. I haven't actually called these people back yet, but that's a very interesting concept, and I think that's something that some patients would very much like to have. At the end of the day, I do what a patient wants me to do. They're your embryos, and I'll, respect your wishes to the extent that I can. Most often patients just say, just destroy them. We don't really care how you do it. And what happens is that they come out of cryopreservation and they go into biohazardous waste. If they haven't given me the right to use those embryos for training employees, then and doing other culturing them further, then it gets tricky doing anything other than just throwing them into the waste. So that's what happens most of the times. I've had patients that wanted to have embryos put in, compressed into a diamond, or put on in grains of sand or rice or what have you. And I'm not here to judge anyone. Whatever helps you heal from your process and move forward and have the best closure is what I feel that should be done for those embryos.
And I just want to say that I have friends and clients who have become mothers because of donated embryos. So I know you said that some people are not comfortable doing it, but when you are comfortable doing it, it is such a blessing to somebody else who has gone through so much to get to the point to find out that their only chance might only be through a donated embryo. And so kind of like what Dr. Edmonds just said, like, you have to decide for yourself what makes you feel the most comfortable. And if it does make you feel comfortable to donate it on an anonymous basis based on what your clinic's options are, it can be such a blessing for another family out there. So it's not for everybody, just like how adoption's not for everybody, genetic testing's not for everybody. This is where you get to do you. And like you said, they're your embryos, you get to decide. But there are options there.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions for me about embryo morphology or anything else embryology? I'm sure Kristin is ready to kick me out, but I'm happy to talk all night.
I just have one quick question.
Sure.
And it's kind of like a blanket question, I guess, but like live birth adoption or, live children adoption out of the womb, are there options for, what was the word? Anonymous embryo adoption and like not anonymous embryo adoption?
I think it's called open.
Open, there you go. Thank you.
That is not something that is really encouraged.
Okay.
Open embryo adoption is something that that is discouraged from the standpoint of our societies and the guidelines and recommendations that they put out. That creates it creates lots of social problems, as you might imagine, for those children as they're growing. And I think even open adoptions are, the world of donor tissue is so complicated now. I mean, the idea of an anonymous donor is a little antiquated in the age of genetic testing and 23andMe and all of these other testing sites where you can figure out who's related to you. The anonymous sperm donors of the 90s have all been found out, and their children are all coming and knocking on their door. And so I think that it's the idea of anonymity in any donor situation is maybe a little bit clouded. But overall, the idea of open embryo donation is frowned upon because it becomes challenging.
And for those of you who joined late, that is, if you didn't know, that's the Birmingham Sky City behind Dr. Edmonds, which is where he's located. So you can feel like you're on a little trip today. But Dr. Edmonds, thank you so much. It's really important information for us to understand, like what happens after the egg retrieval. I think so much as the patient, we're focused on our bodies and how they're going to respond to the stims and the medicine and sort of the reactions, whether physically and hormonally. And then we sort of forget that there's a lot going on in the lab. So now we're all a lot more aware. So I really appreciate you sharing that with me and the rest of us who are here.
Thank you, Dr. Edmonds. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, it means a lot. So thank you. So I am going to talk about preparing for the holidays because they're coming up. And Halloween is right around the corner. And the reason why I thought I'd talk about this tonight is because planning is something we love to do. And usually planning gets taken away from our lives when we're going through IVF because you don't know, you feel like you can't plan a lot of things because you might be, you might have a monitoring appointment, or you might have something else coming up that's going to get in the way, or will you be pregnant by then? And should you travel or not? And there's so much that sometimes gets taken away for us as infertiles who are going through IVF. And with the holidays coming up, it tends to be a really big trigger for us for when we cannot make the family we want in the timeline we want. Every time we see somebody else enjoying milestones of the holidays together, it can tend to be a trigger to point out what we don't have. And so I wanted to share with you, as Halloween is around the corner, Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah and all the time, whether you're together or not, there tends to be a lot of these triggers that happen. And as an infertility coach, I care about your heart, I care about your emotions, and I want to do what we can to protect it. And part of that is a little bit of planning. So the first thing is be prepared for somebody asking you the question. You know, that when are you going to have babies? Are you pregnant yet? Are you trying? I mean, you could probably all raise your hands and tell me that you've been asked that question. It's kind of like, what's the weather like? You know, it's like, oh, when you're dating, people always ask, well, when are you getting engaged? And you're like, if I knew, I would have been engaged by now. But that's just how that is. And then once you get engaged, when's the wedding? And then you get married, and then it's like, when's the kid? And when you have one kid, if you're going through secondary infertility, it's always like, when are you having a second? So it doesn't end. It always happens. You need to be prepared for someone asking you at probably the most inopportune time. And instead of responding by boo-hooing and crying or just like stumbling over your words, it is really important to be prepared. I cannot tell you the impact of being prepared for this question versus the opposite of having you be asked that question and then an hour later being like, I wish I said this, or I should have said this. So we're going to go through a couple things to do to prepare. Know that the question can come from anywhere. It's not just going to happen at a holiday party when you see old friends, parents, or people you haven't talked to a while, or your awkward aunt. It could happen at the grocery store. I literally bumped into a woman I knew at the grocery store from church, and she asked me right there, and I lost it because I was so unprepared. And I was just like, I want to have a baby. If it was up to me, I would have had 3 by now. So it can really be anywhere. This day and age, it can happen on FaceTime. If you're doing like family gatherings on FaceTime to keep your social distancing, it can happen at work. We were talking about football games before this starts. You're never really immune to the question coming up. So just know that it's going to happen. Talk to your partner about the level of comfort of who you want to share what with. You and your partner might have different needs because this impacts you both differently. And that's actually a future workshop we're going to do is going to be talking specifically about male infertility and then also ways to protect your relationship and your marriage. But it is really important for you to both understand where you're at and what your needs are. Like you might be really open and willing to be open about everything, and your partner might not. Sometimes that's because of male factor infertility, and they might feel like, oh, because you're blaming them because of the challenge and the hardship. And sometimes that's totally irrelevant. They're just a little bit more private than you might be. The way I like to look at it is you think of like a target or a bullseye. Your close friends and family are literally in the center. They're the people that you're going to probably share the most with if you choose to open up. And then the level of how much you share with them is up to you. You can say that you're trying, it's harder than you thought, you need medical help, and you'll let them know when it's going on. There might be other people in that circle or that bullseye that you're like, here's everything. I do shots, they go right here. I do them at 7 p.m. at night. I feel like this, I'm bloated. You might share everything and not have any filter. But make sure that you and your partner are on the same page on who you're sharing with, because they might also be asked the same question. And what you don't want is you don't want to find out that they were out with their friends and somebody asked and they shared everything and you wanted to hold it a little bit closer to your heart. So think about the bullseye, and then the next level being like friends, the next level being like acquaintances, and then total strangers. And let me tell you, you are not immune to a total stranger even asking you. So just be on the same page. It really helps to find out how much you both are willing to share and to whom within that realm of the bullseye visual. The other thing is brainstorm the responses that you want to share. Think about it in different ways, again, on that bullseye. How are you going to tell the people in the bullseye? Are you going to be totally transparent? Or are you going to say to them something along the lines, admitting that you're trying, it's a little bit harder than you thought, or it's taking longer than you wished, and you're seeking help right now? And then the other thing is, so you want to be prepared with your responses based on where they are in that target and how much you're comfortable sharing. And what I like to think about is, have a response that really answers that question immediately, very quickly. Then what I like to do is think about different ways to also educate them at the same time, because let me tell you, if each one of us, when we got asked that question, took an extra breath to share why that question is inappropriate, how it might be sensitive to some people, how there's better ways to be a good friend, we can be helping the next future IVF sister who's going through this and who might not be as strong as you are. And then the third thing is you need to ask for what you want from them. Be very clear. So I'm going to give you a couple examples that you could potentially write down, but I would really brainstorm, spend some time, use these as a starting place and brainstorm responses. So some of the things that you might say are, where are my notes? Okay, we're trying, but we need help. We need medical help, and we're seeking that help right now. So thank you for asking. Another sort of in that first part, the response answer, you might say, we'd love to have kids. It just hasn't happened yet. You can say, as soon as we can. You could say, when it's our time, or when it's God's time, depending on where you stand. You can say, only time will tell. And if it was up to me, I'd already have two. I said that one a lot, clearly. So then the next part would be the education part. And so what I would usually say is, when it's our time, we'll know, but it's actually taking longer than I thought, and it's harder than I thought. And that kind of lets them know that, like, this is a challenge. It's not so easy. It's not as easy as just getting married, falling in love, and having sex in your bedroom. Sometimes I've said, asking a question like that can really be hard for someone like me who's struggling and needs medical help to make this happen. Sometimes I've said, did you know that 1 in 8 couples struggle to conceive and need to seek help? We're one of those people. So I start by saying the answer depending on where they are in that bullseye. So if it's somebody really close, I say we're trying, but we need a little bit of help, and it's actually taking longer and harder than we thought. If I'm answering to a total stranger, I'll say, I don't know, time will tell. But you know what? 1 in 8 couples really struggle with going through or trying to grow their families. And so this is a question that might be really sensitive to other people. So you might not want to ask it in the future. I've really said that. And it might make them uncomfortable, but stop being a people pleaser and protect yourself. How uncomfortable are you with that question? You need to do what you need to do to protect yourself and your heart. And that making that 1 minute of uncomfortableness for them, hopefully will teach them to not ask another woman when they're going to have a baby. The third part is letting them know what you need and or asking for help. So things you might be able to say, like, I really appreciate your prayers, so that, you know, this need on our hearts is answered. You can say, I'd love for you to check in on me every once in a while to see how I'm doing, because some days are harder than others. You can say, this is one thing I had to say to people too, where I opened up and I let them know we were going through IVF and doing things, but I say, please let me tell you when I have news to share. I will share with you when there's news to share that I'm ready. So please don't ask. I promise when there's news, you will be notified. Or you can say, I promise when there's news, you'll be one of the first to find out. But what you do by putting all three of these together is you answer the question, you do a little bit of educating, and then you set the precedent by letting them know what you need and how they can be the family member or the friend or the acquaintance who supports you. So practice saying those responses so that when you are asked, it ends up being like human nature, and you respond really quickly and you take out the emotion. And that is how you'll be able to handle getting that question asked to you. The next thing you want to do is protect yourself with boundaries. So sometimes that means saying no to an invitation to a party when you know it's among all of your friend groups who all have kids and all the kids are going to be there and you're just not in the mental space to handle it. It's okay for you to say no. It's okay for you to cancel at the last minute too. You can also prepare certain friends and family and let them know and say, hey, we're going through treatments right now. I'm a little bit hormonal. I really don't want to talk about us and our baby making excursion while we're at the party or while we're in person with other people. I'm comfortable talking about it with you one-on-one, but I don't want to do it in a public setting. You can also stay off of social media on holidays. When you know that people are going to be posting pictures, like on Halloween, people will be posting pictures of their kids in costumes. And if that is like a trigger for you and hurts you, you might want to stay off of social media on Halloween, but also the next day. Because of cool social media algorithms, you might actually see a post from yesterday. So usually I suggest to my clients that they stay off the holiday and the day after, just to give themselves a little bit of space from those triggers. You can also unfollow accounts. You know, social media and access to information is out there, but one of the things that you can control is the information that you do consume. And unfollowing accounts or people who are newly pregnant and it's all they talk about, if that really is a sting for you, you can mute them for a little bit of time where you unfollow, you don't get notifications for them. Give yourself that space. Your happiness is worth it. This is not an easy thing to go through. It is something that makes us feel isolated, and you need to do what works for you to stop those triggers. And then the third thing, as a way to prepare for the holidays or these future triggers, is you get to decide how you respond to that trigger. If it was, you know, your Aunt Molly reaching out and being nosy, well, asking you the question on when you're going to have a baby, you get to choose, is she being nosy or does she care and she's just trying to start a conversation? Most of the time, people are just trying to start a conversation. They do care about you. They just don't know better. And so think about what's going to serve you better in the long run. Is it going to serve you better to be fuming that she had the, you know, guts to ask you this question in front of everybody? Or is it going to serve you better to think, you know what, she's an old lady. She just wants me. She thinks I need to have a baby to be happy. She wants to see me and my husband have a baby and grow our family. And it's just her way of showing she cares and showing interest in us. You really get to choose and ultimately steal away the power of that trigger. When in doubt, assume that they just don't know better. And that's the other reason why I like responding with a part of it being including some education so they do know better. And then the other thing you can do is use that question or use that trigger of somebody posting the picture on social media or all the trick-or-treaters or whatever it is that's really kind of stinging. Choose to let that not actually be a trigger for negativity, use it for a trigger for positivity. Every time you see another woman who's pregnant, you can think that that is a sign to say that you're next, or that that is your future. Every time somebody asks you when you're going to be a mom or if you're going to have kids, you can use that as a sign to say that they also know that you will be an amazing mother. And so that can help grow your belief that it's only a matter of time. As hard as the journey is, it doesn't mean it's not going to work. So you can use those triggers and those events for positive reinforcements to grow your belief and to feel like, you know what, they're asking me, or they're asking me when I'm going to be a mom, because they believe that I'm going to be awesome just like I do. Think about how different your day will be when you respond that way versus carrying the weight and the pressure of being like, oh, that woman drives me bonkers because she's so nosy and she's just pointing out that I'm not a mom yet. Because she's probably not doing that. Hopefully you don't surround yourself with people who are really intentionally mean like that. So those are the 3 things. Plan ahead, practice, talk to your spouse, your partner about it so you're on the same page, practice responses. And put it together where you answer the question on the level that feels comfortable for you, with the level of that you know that person. I think of the bullseye. You also then want to protect yourself with boundaries. Say no to invitations if you can't handle it. Let people know that this is not something you want to talk about in a public setting. You can lay that down, and also unfollow accounts or stay off of social media. And the third thing is you get to choose how that event gets to influence the rest of your day or your week. And I really strongly encourage you to choose it for what's going to serve you better, which is a more positive thought, that it is a sign that it's just a matter of time, that you're next, that is your future. And it will really change your day versus spending the day stewing and boohooing. Oh, that rhymed. Okay, so that is the holiday stuff that I was planning to talk about. Okay, Dr. Edmonds, this is the part where we say thank you for your time. Thank you for the education and the knowledge. Thank you for what you do day in and day out. Because of the work you do, I'm a mother, and the women on this call will be able to have the same outcome, because what you do matters and makes a difference in our lives. And it literally makes me tear up every time. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for listening to me tonight. And I feel thankful to be able to do the job that I do day in and day out. It's incredibly rewarding. And I wish you all the best. Thank you again.